March 3rd, 2008. It's early Monday morning in West New York, New Jersey, a nightlife hub just across the river from Manhattan, where local restaurant staffs are still cleaning up.
West New York has always had a good nightlife, good spots to eat, drink, and dance.
It's primarily a Latino community, and it's a small town feel in an urban setting.
But then at 3 a.m., a call comes into 911 from one of the neighborhood's hotspots, El Balcón.
A woman called in frantic. She tells the operator it's an emergency here and then abruptly hangs up.
Racing to the restaurant, first responders have no idea what they might find.
Could be domestic violence, it could be somebody trying to do a break-in. They don't know.
Inside, they find the 911 caller, Hermania Terrero, with a gravely injured older man.
She tells them that there's been a burglary and that her boyfriend, the owner of the restaurant, has been stabbed.
He's near the bar bleeding from his stomach.
When Araceli Lopez entered a room, everyone noticed.
You could tell that he was coming a mile away because he wore a lot of jewelry. He looked like Mr. T. Masculine looking, and then all the chains, a bunch of bracelets, rings on every finger.
In 1965, he immigrated with his wife from Cuba to New Jersey to pursue the American dream.
They ended up having 2 daughters and a son. He wanted to make sure that his children had a better life.
To get ahead, Araceli worked relentlessly.
Just such a go-getter. He ended up working at a tire place. He ended up a truck driver. And then after that, he got into the restaurant business.
But no matter what, his family was always the most important thing to him. Even after a divorce, he remained devoted to them.
He was a great father.
He was a provider. Whenever my mother didn't have enough money for something, he would send her the money for it.
El Balcón, the restaurant he opened in West New York, New Jersey, was the key to his financial stability.
El Balcón was a hot spot in West New York.
Everybody frequented his restaurant.
And although Araceli could be rough around the edges, he was very beloved for his huge heart.
Él era muy gruñón, pero buena gente. Cuando tú necesitabas algo de él, ya que él te conocía, él te ayudaba.
Lo único malo que como buen cubano hablaba alto, pero eso no quiere decir que gritara. Y entonces él tenía un dicho que decía, yo no estoy gritando, yo lo que le pongo énfasis a la palabra. Entonces yo me reía cuando me decía eso.
In an industry where lines were often crossed, Araceli always kept things professional.
He was all about doing things ethically.
He was very old school.
Él nunca lo hubiera enamorado a ninguna persona. Era un hombre serio.
But in 1999, his life changed forever when a woman named Hermania Terrero walked into El Balcón looking for work.
She was hired. It was important to her to work as hard as she could because Hermania still had family that was located in the Dominican Republic. She wanted to bring them here to the States.
Though she was in her 40s and Araceli was in his 60s, as the two spent time together, their chemistry was undeniable.
She tells him she's married, but it was only for papers.
She was an attractive woman, fun, outgoing.
You look really nice tonight.
Thank you, handsome.
But there's a little click, a little fire.
Before long, they both seemed smitten.
He wined her, dined her.
Their relationship developed pretty quickly into something serious. And Araceli moved Hermania in with him.
He also gave her more responsibility at work.
She went from just employee to actually managing the entire upstairs portion of the restaurant.
And to Araceli, her family was his family.
He brought Hermania's daughters from the DR here to the US.
He also set them up in an apartment within the building that he resided in with her mother.
He also helped out her extended family, still in the DR.
He invested in a restaurant in the Dominican Republic that her family ran.
Already united as one, Hermania and Araceli were taking steps to make things official.
Hermania ended up divorcing the man that she was married to just for convenience. And to show that their relationship was locked in, he actually amended his will. In the will, he left the restaurant to Hermania. They were future focused and really developing and building a permanent life together.
Only now, their bright future seems in jeopardy.
There was a 911 call that came from the restaurant. When first responders arrive on scene, they see Araceli and he is bleeding profusely.
Araceli's conscious, but there's a long, deep slash in his stomach.
But as paramedics rush him to the ambulance, Araceli manages to give key information about the assailants.
Araceli says the restaurant was robbed by two men and that he'd actually seen them around the neighborhood before.
Restaurant owner Araceli Lopez had finally found love again with 43-year-old Hermania Terrero.
There's some real connection, some real energy.
They held themselves out to be sort of husband and wife. They lived together, they worked together, they were together a lot.
But now, after Hermania called 911 and first responders found Araceli stabbed inside his restaurant, he's on the way to the hospital.
He ended up getting in the ambulance, still awake.
He told EMTs that his attackers were two men he's seen around the neighborhood before.
As the ambulance pulls away, detectives arrive and approach an emotional Hermania.
How you doing? I know it's a difficult time, but we need your help to try to find these attackers.
I'll do whatever I can.
Hermania begins by walking investigators through what led up to the attack.
After the last employees left, she and Araceli locked the door. She was having a drink at the bar while Araceli did some final closing acts. Then Araceli went to the back in order to heat up some soup so they could have a late dinner.
She says it was then that two men suddenly emerged from upstairs.
What are you doing?
Shut up!
Get off of me!
Hermania says she was shocked. Both of the assailants were Black men. They were over 6 feet tall, and one had a knife while the other assailant had a machete.
They must have been upstairs hiding.
She says she didn't even have time to think before they began making demands.
They spoke perfect English without an accent, and they demand that she gives them all the money out of the register.
According to Hermania, it was at that moment that Araceli came out of the kitchen, surprising the assailants.
They grabbed him immediately. They throw him to the ground violently.
Stop!
She describes being held off by the assailant with the machete, while the one with the knife attacked Araceli.
He eventually stabs him in the stomach.
Then, she says the assailants fled, taking the stolen items with them.
They take all the jewelry that Araceli was wearing, including a Rolex watch and a bag of money.
As soon as the door shut, Hermania says she rushed to Araceli's side.
She was able to help him get into the chair.
That's when I called 911.
Have you seen these assailants before? In a neighborhood or even in the restaurant?
No, officer.
As for who would want to hurt Araceli, Hermania isn't sure.
You know, if people got too drunk or too rowdy, it was the nature of the business to ask them to leave. And Araceli owed a couple people money, but outside of that, she couldn't really name anyone that would want to hurt Araceli.
People really like him.
Although, after more reflection, she does think of someone detectives should talk to. El Balcón employee, Hector Vasquez.
Hector had worked at the restaurant, but Hector had gotten into many fights. He would be rowdy, he would be loud, and he even got into a fight with a police officer. So Araceli had to fire him.
But recently, Hermania says Araceli made the decision to give him a second chance.
I didn't think it was a good idea, but he insisted.
Araceli assured her that it was just for one day to see how things went.
She tells them that Hector worked a shift on Saturday without incident and returned on Sunday to get paid.
Araceli paid him, and Hector relaxed at the bar, having a beer or two.
How long before closing did he leave?
A while.
Naturally, detectives will need to follow up with Hector as a person of interest.
But first, they look through the restaurant for evidence.
They noticed that there is no forced entry. So it seems like what Hermania was telling them was true, that these intruders were actually inside the restaurant already and hiding while they closed up.
Noticing surveillance cameras, detectives hope they might provide clues.
But the security cameras were not recording. Hermania tells investigators that she and Araceli just hadn't bothered with them for a while.
After wrapping up at the crime scene, investigators head to the hospital, hoping to interview Araceli.
They had gotten a report from EMTs that he had given them a brief rundown of assailants.
So they wanted to hear directly from him what their description was and to try to piece together what happened from his perspective.
But when they arrive, Araceli is in no state to talk.
He came out of surgery okay, but on the way into recovery, his heart stopped.
The doctors were able to restart his heart, but because of all the trauma to his body, they had to put him on a ventilator.
Mr. Lopez was in a coma.
Arriving at the hospital to interview assault victim Araceli Lopez, West New York detectives are met with upsetting news.
He's in a coma now.
Perhaps he was not going to live.
It's a definite blow to the case.
And to Araceli's family.
We found out in the morning he ended up at the hospital.
We didn't know how it had happened.
With the family en route to the hospital, investigators turn their attention to El Balcón employee and person of interest, Hector Vasquez.
He had been fired from the restaurant, and he was there the night Araceli was attacked. Perhaps there was bad blood between him and Araceli.
They had to speak to him and understand if he knew anything about what happened.
When investigators bring up his dismissal, he doesn't run from the story.
He's like, yeah, I got fired, but Mr. Lopez was giving me another chance.
And if things went well, he would be able to have a conversation about hopefully getting his job back. It was going in a positive direction.
Hector had no reason to have any conflict with him.
But Hector claims he did witness something the night of the attack that detectives should know.
While he was at the restaurant, the two guys come into the space, and there is some conflict almost immediately with Mr. Lopez.
About what?
I'm not sure. I just heard Mr. Lopez say that they had to go.
At first, they ignored him, and then, he was insistent, you cannot be here.
Hector says at that point the men got up to leave. But what one of them did as he walked out the door surprised him.
He turned and blew a kiss right at Araceli.
It really seemed like a threat.
Anybody that knows some old mafioso knows about the kiss of death.
Detectives need to know if the men Hector saw that evening match the description of the assailants that Hermania gave them.
He describes two guys, barely 5'10".
One man was darker skinned, and the other man was lighter skinned, and he was pretty sure that the two men were Mexican.
Detectives aren't sure what to make of Hector's descriptions.
They don't match the descriptions they've been given.
Detectives were wondering if Hector was trying to throw them off with this description. Maybe he was involved and wanted to divert attention.
Reaching out to other employees, detectives attempt to corroborate what Hector told them.
We got witnesses.
They all said that the description that Hector gave was accurate.
Perhaps it was just a coincidence that these men threatened Araceli that night, then later, a different pair of men, the men Miss Terrero described, came in and perpetrated their attack.
According to employees, someone may have been out to get Araceli, because he had also been the victim of two other recent robberies.
The year before this happened, someone robbed him at the restaurant.
And about a month before, somebody had broken into his apartment, which was very near the restaurant.
When investigators pull the police reports on these crimes, both suggest they were inside jobs.
The first robbery at the restaurant, they broke into his office. He had several frames on the walls. Only one frame was removed, and that's where the safe was. Who would know that?
The robbery at Araceli's apartment looked like more of the same.
They took like $30K in jewelry. There was no sign of forced entry.
So obviously a key was used.
And nothing in the whole apartment was turned over. They went straight to where it was. So somebody knew where it was.
Police are starting to suspect that these crimes were no coincidence.
Maybe what happened at the restaurant is connected to the robbery at the residence.
When investigators finally get the chance to sit down with Araceli's daughter, Belkis Orozco Lopez, she doesn't know who committed the robberies, but she does know why her father owed people money.
For some reason, the landlord of the restaurant did not collect rent on a regular basis. He would collect it every few months, sometimes several months at a time. So Araceli kept large sums of cash in this safe. When the safe was actually robbed, all the money was taken out.
At that point, he calls me and he tells me he was going to pawn all of the jewelry.
He'd even had it all appraised.
The jewelry was worth $30,000. He ended up bringing the jewelry back to his apartment, but shortly after, his apartment was robbed and all the jewelry was stolen. After that, Araceli had no choice but to borrow money to keep up with his rent.
But that's not the only surprising information Araceli's daughter gives investigators.
His daughter tells detectives that Araceli and Hermania were not together.
They recently broke up.
When Araceli Lopez's daughter, Belkis, speaks with West New York police, she reveals that her father and Hermania Terrero were no longer a couple.
They broke up recently.
Which raises investigators' suspicions about her possible involvement in the attack.
She becomes a person of interest.
Belkis says that she barely knew Hermania, but her sister, who worked at the restaurant, got to know her well.
My sister started working at the restaurant, and they became friends, but she had no idea that they were going out.
But Belkis says their friendship didn't last long.
She wanted more control of the restaurant, but my sister's very strong-willed with my father.
Hey, babe. I think we need to expand the menu.
Why would you do that, Dad? Business is going great already.
I might be open to it.
By then, Belkis says her sister had discovered the relationship between her father and Hermania, but chose not to interfere.
There's not really much you could do about it.
But Belkis says Hermania didn't have the same hands-off approach.
She drives a wedge between Mr. Lopez and his daughter.
My sister started dating somebody that my father didn't like, and she used that to cause the rift between them. She filled my father up with lies. He got mad, and he told her, I told you not to see that guy, and you're doing it behind my back.
She ended up being fired from the restaurant. And Araceli went so far as to change the locks.
Finally, though, a few months prior to his attack, it seemed Araceli had seen the light.
He finally called things off with Miss Terrero, and that wasn't all.
Hermania was taken out of the will.
When detectives ask if Belkis believes Hermania was behind the attack against her father, she says she wouldn't be surprised, but she can't be sure.
She says, I don't know.
See, there were other threats against him.
One night, her father went back to his car and discovered that one of the windows had been kicked in.
Then this anonymous caller told Araceli that this time it was the car, but next time it would be him.
Somebody's got some real beef directed at Araceli.
When police ask who else might give them more insight, she suggests they talk to her father's former manager, Alex Ortiz.
Alex was always like my dad's right hand. He was also like a son to my dad.
Why doesn't he work there anymore?
Hermania, he could not take her anymore.
She said he left because of Miss Terrero.
Thank you for stopping by and sharing the information.
When police meet with Alex, he confirms that he did have issues with Aracelio's former girlfriend.
When she took over, the restaurant was never making the same amount of money. Alex knew that she was robbing him blind.
But when Alex told Aracelio, he refused to listen.
Enamorado, encaprichado, y no quería aceptarlo. Y así, Hermania me había sacado a mí del negocio.
However, Alex says a few months ago, Aracelio came to him singing a different tune.
Con la forma de ella de ser con él empezó a sospechar que ella tenía otra persona. Ella se le escondía, ella ya como que no quería saber de él. Una vez le dijo que estaba en el hospital y Aracelio fue al hospital con un ramo de flores y ella en ningún momento estaba en ese hospital.
So when Aracelio asked Alex to spy on Hermania, he agreed out of loyalty.
Yo la hice porque como teníamos tanta amistad.
But Alex admits it was no easy task.
Me puso a mí a grabar conversaciones, me puso a mí a tratar de vigilarla, pero era muy complicado, era muy difícil encontrar algo porque el mismo edificio tenía dos entradas y a veces si ella salía por una entrada o salía por la otra, yo no podía saber.
Although Alex's instincts told him that Hermania was cheating, he never found any proof.
Lo que nunca pudimos descubrirla.
But Alex says Aracelio couldn't trust her anymore.
And that was why he had broken up with her.
So was Hermania cheating? To find out more, investigators approached the building management.
Do you know Mr. Lopez?
I do. He was a very good tenant.
He was very pleasant. He would come in every couple of weeks and bring the office staff trays of food for lunch. He was kind and really good-hearted like that.
Did you know his girlfriend?
I did.
He brought her to the office. He introduced me to her. She was nice to me.
I also helped him get an apartment for her daughters here in the building.
They were very, very young. Late teens, early 20s. And he wanted the daughters to stay close to their mother, so I gave him another apartment.
When investigators ask if Hermania might have been cheating on Araceli, she says it was possible.
From what I witnessed, he was very nice to her, but it just didn't feel right to me. She was so much younger than he was, and I just felt like he was a sugar daddy for her.
And though she hadn't seen it herself, some people on her staff had witnessed her leaving the building several times with the same mystery person.
They did observe her get into a white luxury car.
But the building manager also tells police that she suspected Hermania of something far worse.
Did you gentlemen happen to hear about the recent robbery in Mr. Lopez's apartment?
Actually, we did.
I had my suspicions that somehow, some way, she could have possibly been involved.
West New York detectives have just found out that Hermania Torrero may have been cheating on Araceli Lopez before he broke things off.
She had been seen leaving the building with an unidentified man in a white luxury car.
Even worse, the building manager also suggests Hermania may be behind the recent robbery at Aracelio's apartment.
She told me she had lost the keys, and I had another set made immediately for her. But come to find out after, she wasn't living with Mr. Lopez because they were having differences.
If I had known they were separated, I would have never given her those keys.
At the time, the building manager kept her suspicions to herself.
I didn't want to accuse her.
Now with everything that's happened, I really thought you guys should know.
Thank you.
With suspicion swirling around Hermania, investigators pull her phone records from the days leading up to the attack.
The day of the robbery, she made a number of calls to two numbers.
Investigators learn that one of the numbers is registered to Robert Santana, and the other number is registered to Christian Molina.
When investigators try to locate Christian Molina, he's in the wind.
He is nowhere to be found.
But when they visit the address listed for Robert Santana, they have better luck.
The young gentleman comes out. I had asked to speak to Mr. Santana, but we were informed he had left for Florida.
But the man who was Robert's brother-in-law was able to get an address for them.
Before leaving, detectives ask one more critical question.
I said, do you know if Robert Santana hangs out with someone that drives a white luxury car?
Yeah, he had a friend who drove around.
You wouldn't happen to have a picture of that person, would you?
He says, actually, I do.
The picture just so happens to be of Christian Molina.
Now detectives are sure that they know the two men that killed Araceli.
And if that's true, it also means Hermania had purposely deceived police.
Hermania said that both of the assailants were black men, that they were over 6 feet tall.
But why would she have lied?
Because they got this big unknown, they focus on finding Robert and Christian.
Investigators collaborate with the Tampa Police Department, asking them to locate Robert Santana.
And for Christian, they reach out to the U.S. Marshals for help.
In the meantime, the case takes a tragic turn.
When 2 weeks came up, the doctor pretty much told us he's been brain dead.
Now, the family is forced to make a heartbreaking decision.
They make the choice to take him off of life support.
With Araceli deceased, detectives now face a homicide investigation.
He would not have been put in that situation if it weren't for the assault that had occurred.
But there is some good news. Florida police have apprehended Robert Santana.
We met with Tampa detectives, and we used their facilities to conduct the investigations of Mr. Robert Santana.
And when they confront him about his role in Araceli Lopez's murder, the floodgates open.
This has been weighing down on his conscience.
I'll tell you everything.
Robert tells detectives that Christian had been pressuring him to pull off a robbery at El Balcón for over a year.
He initially wanted nothing to do with that, but Christian told Robert they would leave with a big score.
He tells me he has a connect on the inside.
She was totally in on it.
She would make sure that they would be able to get in and out quickly.
Eventually, Robert came to realize that this could be a quick solution to his problems.
He was going through financial hardships.
He told Christian he was only in on one condition.
He would only do it if Christian would promise that nobody would get hurt.
He tells me, you're good, man.
So early in the morning on March 3rd, he and Christian headed to the restaurant.
Plan was the front door would be open and nobody was in the establishment except for Ms. Terrero and the victim, Mr. Araceli Lopez.
Then all they had to do was wait for her signal.
It's time.
But Robert says that nothing went as planned.
They walk into the front door as Araceli is coming out of the kitchen.
Christian Molina immediately begins to assault him.
Hermania made a fake, half-hearted attempt to intervene.
But Robert, horrified by Christian's actions, does try to stop the attack.
Yo, what the hell? Punch me again, and you're next.
But Christian turned around with the knife.
That's when he lunged the knife into Araceli.
Robert says it was his worst nightmare come true.
At this point, he runs out of the restaurant.
Robert says moments later, Christian came outside, and the men fled the scene.
What time was this? It was like 2:30 or so.
And it was about 20 minutes later that Hermania called 911.
Robert's statement gives investigators more than enough probable cause to arrest Hermania Terrero in the death of Araceli Lopez.
She was the driving force.
Her arrest comes as a shock to those who knew them.
En mi cabeza no cabe de que ella haya querido que lo mataran con lo bueno que él había sido con ella durante todos esos años que ellos estuvieron.
Eventually, federal marshals locate Christian Molina, but he remains out of reach.
Christian got out of the country, ultimately to Venezuela. But Venezuela doesn't do extradition.
Prosecutors will need to get creative if they want to win this case.
Though killer Christian Molina is still on the run, investigators are moving forward in their felony murder case against Hermania Terrero. But proving her guilt won't be easy.
We had to prove that she was part of the planning of the robbery. And now she knew that there was a likelihood that Christian Molina was going to harm Araceli Lopez.
To get a conviction, investigators believe they need Robert Santana's testimony.
We were forced to make a deal.
The prosecution decides to reduce his charges from murder to robbery, and Robert Santana agrees to testify.
When Hermania's trial opens in March 2011, it's emotional for Aracelio's family.
It was definitely difficult to see them during the trial. There were a lot of tears.
In their opening statements, prosecutors portray Hermania as a woman driven by lust and greed.
There's a breakup, her money source is gone now. She's gonna lose everything.
She wanted his assets and to substitute Christian Molina for Araceli Lopez and move forward in the little life that they had created.
Together, she and Christian hatched a plan to rob El Balcone. Then Christian recruited Robert Santana as his accomplice.
Christian was able to convince Robert because he told him that this would be an easy score.
While prosecutors don't know if Hermania planned for Christian to kill Araceli, they underline that violence was likely to occur.
After all, both assailants came in with weapons.
Even if she didn't want to kill him, she still put it together to rob him, and that's how he ended up getting stabbed and dying from it.
To prove their case, prosecutors call their star witness, Robert Santana.
He was probably on the stand for 2 days.
He testified about Miss Torero's plan.
She's the one that put everything together.
She made sure that she and Araceli were alone in the restaurant. Then she called to tell them when to enter the restaurant, which was backed up by phone records.
And Robert Santana's background made him more believable. He did not have an extensive criminal record. He was a hardworking family man, loved his wife, came up from Florida, became friends with the wrong people, and specifically Christian Molina, and eventually gave into the idea that he was just going to commit a robbery, that he just needed the money, and that it was just going to be a robbery.
When it's the defense's turn, they don't deny Hermania was involved in the robbery. But they insist there was only one person responsible for Araceli's murder. Christian Molina.
She said she didn't know Christian was going to stab Mr. Lopez, and she was shocked and appalled and called him evil, that he was motivated by jealousy, suggesting that being in his restaurant, seeing that he owned this building, triggered something in Christian that made him snap.
And Hermania's attorneys portray Robert Santana as an opportunist.
They say the only reason Robert is trying to implicate her is so that he isn't implicated in murder.
But who will the jury believe?
I was worried about the jury the entire time. They wouldn't even look at me.
You never know for certain whether you have a jury or not.
But on April 7th, 2011, when the verdict returns, the prosecution triumphs.
She's found guilty of felony murder.
Felony murder carries the same penalties as murder. So yeah, she received 30 years.
For Araceli's family, it's a bittersweet moment.
They're thrilled that she was going to have to pay the price for what she had done, but it didn't bring their father back.
On July 1st, 2011, Robert Santana faces sentencing.
Robert Santana gets 10 years for the robbery.
To this day, Christian Molina has never been caught.
The guy that actually did it, which is the one that I would love to beat up myself, he got away.
Falta la otra persona. Hasta que él no esté preso, yo no creo que hagan la justicia completa.
Araceli's family constantly struggles to make sense of Hermania's heinous crime.
You had no reason to take his life. You had no reason to do what you did to him.
But even though Araceli was gone, he'll never be forgotten.
He would be 84 now. We missed a lot that he wasn't able to be a part of.
I'm really grateful to him and for everything he did for us as a family, and enjoyed every time that we used to get together. I still miss him.
At the time of this production, Christian Molina remains at large. If you have any information on his whereabouts, contact your local authorities immediately. You can also leave an anonymous tip with Hudson County at 201-915-1345 or by visiting hcpo.opsnetwork.org/tips.
The glass looked ordinary. A cheap cup, nothing remarkable about it. Nothing that, at first glance, appeared capable of changing the course of a murder investigation that had haunted East Harlem for years. But there was something on the rim. Saliva. And inside that saliva was a biological signature that investigators had been searching for, without knowing exactly whose name they were looking for. For years, young women had been attacked in the same part of Manhattan. Some survived. Others never went home. Police had descriptions. They had witnesses. They had fragments of evidence. They had suspicions. But suspicion was not enough. Then science began connecting crimes that had once appeared separate. And eventually, that tiny biological trace on a discarded cup would point to a man investigators already feared was responsible. His name was Aaron Key. In East Harlem, he was known by another name, Ace. Long before detectives knew the full scale of the crimes, the neighborhood had already begun to change around them. Stairwells became places where young women hurried through without looking behind them. Apartment entrances felt different after dark. A familiar face could suddenly become a source of suspicion. Parents warned daughters to stay together. Residents talked in hushed voices about attacks that seemed to have no connection, no pattern, no ending. The first murder attributed to Key occurred in January 1991. Paula Ilera was only 13 years old. She had been living in East Harlem, a neighborhood where children knew the buildings around them, knew the elevators, knew which doors belonged to which families. That familiarity could create a dangerous illusion of safety. On January 24th, Paula disappeared. Investigators would later determine that she had been abducted near her apartment building. Her body was discovered hours later near the East River. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. She had also suffered stab wounds. The case was horrifying, but at that moment, there was no obvious serial killer standing behind it. There was only a dead child, grieving relatives, frightened neighbors, and detectives trying to understand what had happened. A witness had reportedly seen a young man entering an elevator with Paula shortly before her disappearance. A name would eventually surface. Aaron Warford, the surname Key used at the time. But suspicion did not equal proof. And the years continued. In the early 1990s, forensic DNA technology existed, but it was not the investigative weapon it would later become. New York did not yet have the modern system of routine DNA collection that investigators would eventually rely upon. A suspect could not simply be compelled to provide a biological sample whenever detectives wanted one. That limitation would become critical, because somewhere in Manhattan, a predator was still moving, and the attacks continued. In 1994, another teenage girl was assaulted. The circumstances were disturbingly similar. A young woman, a secluded location, a male attacker, a pattern of control and humiliation. The victim survived, and her description gave investigators something they desperately needed: a living witness who could describe the person who had attacked her. But even then, the case did not immediately produce a definitive answer. The name Aaron Key would appear again. Yet there was still not enough to close the door. Not enough to put the suspect behind bars for the crimes that investigators increasingly feared were connected. Then came 1997. September 13th. 19-year-old Johalis Castro was inside the George Washington houses in East Harlem. She would not survive the night. Her body was discovered in the basement of the apartment building after a fire crew responded to the scene. The circumstances were so brutal that investigators faced a nightmare of possibilities. The victim had been sexually assaulted. She had been attacked inside a building that should have offered some degree of familiarity and protection. And the person responsible appeared to have taken extraordinary steps to destroy evidence and identity. Investigators questioned people who knew Castro. Aaron Key came to their attention. There were phone calls. There were connections between people in the neighborhood. There were explanations. Key reportedly told investigators that his girlfriend was friends with Castro and that they had planned to go shopping. His girlfriend confirmed the basic story. And once again, the investigation moved forward without the breakthrough detectives needed. The suspect remained outside. The case remained open. And the killer remained somewhere in the city. Then, in 1998, another teenage girl was attacked. By this point, investigators were beginning to hear the same details again and again. The same kind of victim. The same neighborhood. The same pattern. The same disturbing behavior. But patterns are only useful when someone recognizes them. And sometimes the most dangerous period in a serial investigation is the period before investigators realize they are looking at a serial offender. Every individual case can appear isolated. Every victim has her own story. Every crime scene seems to belong to a different night. Every witness remembers a different detail. But the offender sees the city as one continuous hunting ground. And that was East Harlem in the 1990s. Then came June 2nd, 1998. 18-year-old Rashida Washington was found dead in the stairwell of a housing project on East 112th Street. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. The location was another piece of the growing puzzle. But this time, investigators had something that would change everything. Biological evidence. Evidence that could be tested. Evidence that could potentially answer the question detectives have been asking for years. Was the same man responsible? The laboratory comparison began connecting the dots. The biological evidence from Washington's case was compared with evidence from earlier sexual assaults. The results were devastating. The same genetic profile appeared across multiple crimes. Suddenly, what it looked like separate attacks began to resemble a single criminal campaign. A serial offender was operating in East Harlem, and now investigators needed a name. The police began assembling the pieces. Descriptions from surviving victims, locations, phone records, clothing, prior contacts, neighborhood information. Then an anonymous caller contacted police. The caller identified a man known as Ace. Detectives discovered that Ace was Aaron Key. The name immediately mattered. Key had lived in the neighborhood. He had connections to the locations. And investigators already had reasons to examine his history. There was another detail. After September 1998 assault, the attacker had apparently left behind clothing. A black baseball cap, a sweatshirt. Investigators examined the clothing and followed a laundry tag to a dry cleaner. The customer connection led toward Key's family. Piece by piece, the circle tightened. But the detectives still faced one enormous obstacle. They needed DNA. They believed Key could be the man behind the attacks. They believed the biological evidence could prove it. But they could not simply walk up to him and demand a sample. So they watched him. They followed him. They waited. They hoped he would spit. They hoped he would discard chewing gum. They hoped he would leave behind something that could legally and scientifically provide the answer. The surveillance was frustrating. Key knew enough to be cautious. He refused to cooperate with requests for a DNA sample. Investigators needed another opportunity. Then, in February 1999, that opportunity came in a completely different case. Key was arrested in connection with the theft of computer equipment. It was not a murder arrest. It was not a rape arrest. It was not the dramatic confrontation investigators had imagined. It was a theft case. But inside custody, detectives saw the opening they had been waiting for. They attempted to obtain a biological sample. Key refused. The investigation could have stalled again, but investigators did not stop looking. They watched. They waited. And eventually, Key left behind something as ordinary as the cup that would become one of the most important objects in the entire case. Saliva was recovered. The laboratory performed the analysis. The genetic profile was compared with biological evidence from the crimes. The result was the moment the investigation changed direction. The DNA matched. The suspect investigators had been circling was now connected scientifically to the crime evidence. The years of uncertainty began collapsing. But Key was no longer simply a suspect. He was a man investigators believed was connected to multiple violent crimes. And then something unexpected happened. Before police could fully close the net, Key fled New York. He took a 16-year-old girl, Angelique Stallings, with him. The investigation instantly became a manhunt. New York was no longer the only place detectives had to watch. The trail moved south. Florida. Hotels. Changing locations. A young girl believed to be in danger. A wanted suspect believed to be connected to multiple murders and sexual assaults. The case had become a race against time. In February 1999, investigators located Key in Miami. Police moved in. The hotel room was breached. Key was captured. Angelique Stallings was found alive in an adjoining room. The escape had ended. But the investigation was only beginning to reveal how much had been hidden. Once Key's DNA profile was available, investigators could compare it against biological evidence preserved from earlier cases. And the profile began speaking for itself. Old files were reopened. Evidence that had sat in storage for years suddenly became relevant. Crime scenes that had once seemed disconnected could now be tested against a known genetic profile. The investigation reached backward through time. 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. Years of unanswered questions were being revisited through forensic science. Paula Ilera, Johalis Castro, Rashida Washington, and several surviving victims. The DNA evidence helped establish connections that investigators had struggled to prove through conventional detective work. That is what made the case so important. DNA did not replace detectives. It gave detectives the ability to connect what they had been unable to connect before. A witness might remember a face. A detective might remember a name. A crime scene might contain a clue. But DNA could bridge years. It could link one biological trace to another. And when those traces came from separate victims, separated by time and circumstance, the pattern became almost impossible to dismiss. The prosecution eventually brought a massive case against Key. The charges involved the 3 murders and multiple sexual assaults. At trial, Key denied the allegations. The DNA evidence became central. Surviving victims also identified him. The prosecution was no longer relying on a single clue. It was presenting a chain. Victim testimony, physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and the genetic evidence that tied the crimes together. The trial became a confrontation between a defendant insisting that investigators had constructed a case against him and prosecutors presenting scientific evidence that appeared to connect him directly to the crimes. The courtroom heard about the young victims, the attacks, the murders, the years of investigation, the fear that had spread through East Harlem, and the forensic breakthrough that had finally given investigators the evidence they needed. In December 2000, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. The man investigators had once been forced to watch from a distance was now a convicted murderer and rapist. The sentence that followed effectively ensured he would never return to ordinary life. But the case did not end with the verdict, because investigators continued examining older unsolved crimes. DNA had changed the investigation. And once investigators possessed Key's genetic profile, every preserved piece of biological evidence potentially became another question. Could this be him? Could that old rape be connected? Could another unsolved case finally have a name? In 2004, testing linked Key to another rape dating back to 1994. The case had survived for a decade. The evidence had survived. And the DNA profile had survived with it. Key was prosecuted again. This time, according to accounts of proceedings, he admitted responsibility for the rape and expressed remorse. He received an additional sentence. The forensic trail had continued to reach backward. That is the enduring lesson of the Aaron Key investigation. A murder investigation can appear frozen. A rape case can sit in a file cabinet for years. A piece of biological evidence can remain silent for a decade. But silence is not the same as disappearance. Evidence can wait. Technology can change. And when science catches up with an old crime, the past can suddenly become present again. For East Harlem, however, the damage could never be measured in laboratory reports. There were families who had buried daughters. There were survivors who had to live with memories that could not be tested away. There were residents who had watched their neighborhood become associated with fear. And there was a question that remains painfully familiar in cold case investigations everywhere. How many victims might have been spared if the technology available later had existed earlier? That question is impossible to answer. But the timeline offers a chilling clue. Paula Ilera died in 1991. Years passed. Other attacks followed. Joe Holly's Castro was murdered in 1997. Rashida Washington was murdered in 1998. The offender remained free. Then DNA began connecting the crimes. And in 1999, the investigation finally had the biological evidence needed to identify Aaron Key. The story is sometimes described as a triumph of DNA. And scientifically it was. But that description can make the human cost disappear. DNA did not prevent the crimes. It did not bring the victims back. It did not erase the fear. It simply gave investigators something that the killer could not talk his way out of. A genetic signature. Invisible. Silent. Patient. Waiting inside evidence collected years before. That is what makes the image of the discarded cup so powerful. Nothing about it looked dramatic. No flashing police lights. No chase. No confession. Just an ordinary object left behind by a man who believed he could refuse the test. He had refused to provide the sample voluntarily. He had resisted investigators. He had attempted to remain beyond the reach of the evidence. But biological evidence does not require confession. It does not care whether a suspect agrees with the investigation. It does not care whether a suspect claims innocence. If the biological material is sufficient and properly analyzed, it can speak in a language of its own. And in this case, it spoke loudly. It connected a man to crimes that had haunted New York for years. It transformed suspicion into evidence. It turned a neighborhood rumor into a prosecutable case. And it demonstrated something investigators around the country were beginning to understand at the end of the 20th century. The future of criminal investigation was changing. Old cases could be reopened. Archived evidence could be tested again. A crime scene that had once produced no answer could suddenly produce a name. The killer could believe he had escaped because the detectives did not have enough evidence. But evidence does not always need to be discovered immediately. Sometimes it only needs to survive. Years after the first murder, the investigation finally reached the man investigators believed responsible. The courtroom became the place where years of fear were translated into evidence. The names of the victims were spoken again. The surviving witnesses faced a man they identified. The DNA results were examined, and the jury made its decision. Guilty. For Aaron Key, the pursuit was over. For the families, there was no such thing as truly being finished. A conviction can close a legal case. It cannot close a life. It cannot restore a daughter to her parents. It cannot erase the memory of a telephone call that never came. It cannot undo the years when a killer was walking through the same streets as the people he had already harmed. And it cannot answer every question. The most haunting part of the story may be the period before the DNA breakthrough. The years when investigators suspected. The years when evidence existed but technology was limited. The years when victims were attacked and the connections remained hidden. Because the case demonstrates how close an investigation can be to the truth without actually reaching it. A detective can have a suspect. A witness can provide a description. A piece of clothing can point toward a name. A phone call can raise suspicion. But until the evidence crosses the threshold from suspicion to proof, the case remains vulnerable. DNA changed that equation. The genetic profile became the thread. One crime connected to another. One victim connected to another. 1 year connected to another. 1991 became 1994. 1994 became 1997. 1997 became 1998. And 1998 became 1999. 8 years of violence compressed into a single forensic narrative. The man known as Ace was no longer just a name whispered around East Harlem. He was Aaron Key. And the evidence had finally caught up with him. Today, the image that remains is not the courtroom alone. It is the contrast between something enormous and something almost invisible. On one side, years of fear. 3 murdered young women. Surviving victims. Families destroyed. A neighborhood traumatized. On the other side, a microscopic biological trace. That contrast is the reason the case remains a landmark example of forensic investigation. The evidence was small. The consequences were enormous. And somewhere between the first unanswered murder and the final courtroom verdict was a lesson that investigators would carry into the future. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the evidence is still there. Sometimes the technology has simply not caught up with it yet. And sometimes, years after the crime, a single biological trace can reopen the past with devastating clarity. For East Harlem, the name Aaron Key became inseparable from a period of fear that began with the death of a 13-year-old girl and ended with a courtroom conviction years later. But the victims came first, before the DNA, before the headlines, before the manhunt, before the courtroom. There were young women whose lives were interrupted. There were families waiting for answers. And there were investigators staring at evidence. Try to understand what had happened. The answers came slowly, painfully, one clue at a time, until science finally connected the invisible dots. And the man who had spent years moving through the same city as his victims could no longer hide behind uncertainty. The evidence had found him. The DNA had spoken. And after years of unanswered questions, the name behind the crimes was finally known. The name was finally known. But knowing the name was only the beginning. For investigators, the arrest of Aaron Key did not erase the years that had come before it. It did not suddenly make every unanswered question disappear. Instead, the arrest opened a darker door. Behind it was a trail that stretched across much of the 1990s, through apartment buildings, housing projects, stairwells, streets, and ordinary places where young women had once believed they were safe. And now detectives had something they had never possessed before: a complete genetic profile. That changed the investigation completely. Before Key's DNA was identified, investigators had been forced to work backward from memories. A survivor might remember a face. Another might remember a voice. Someone else might remember clothing. A witness might recall seeing a man near a building at a certain hour. Those details mattered. But memories fade. Descriptions change. People misremember. DNA does not have a memory. It leaves a biological trace. And when investigators compare that trace against evidence preserved from earlier crimes, the past began opening one case at a time. The first murder had happened in 1991. Paula Ilera was 13. That fact alone was enough to transform the case from another violent crime into something that would remain in the memories of detectives for decades. She was a child who had disappeared from her own neighborhood, a child whose body was later found near the East River. The crime had shocked East Harlem, but the investigation had not produced the certainty police needed. Years later, when the DNA evidence pointed toward Key, investigators could look at the old case through a completely different lens. The question was no longer simply, who killed Paula Ilera? The question became, what else was this man responsible for? That distinction was enormous. Because once detectives had reason to believe Key was connected to one murder, they began examining every other case in which his name, his movements, or his biological evidence appeared. The investigation became a reconstruction, not of one night, of years. And the further detectives looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Key had lived in and around the same community as many of the victims. He knew the buildings. He knew the streets. He knew how people moved through the neighborhood. That familiarity could make an offender almost invisible. A stranger walking behind a young woman might attract attention. A man from the neighborhood might not. He could blend into the background. He could appear ordinary. And that is one of the most difficult realities of serial investigations. The person investigators are searching for does not necessarily look like a monster. He may look like someone who belongs there. Someone who passes through the same stores. Someone who knows the same streets. Someone whose face may already be familiar to the people he targets. For years, Key existed inside that environment. And while detectives searched for answers, the victims became the evidence that eventually connected him to the crimes. The surviving women were especially important. They were not simply witnesses. They were people who had lived through the attacks. Their memories became part of the case. When investigators brought those memories together with forensic evidence, the picture became much clearer. The DNA could establish biological connections. The witnesses could establish human connections. The locations could establish geographic connections. The timeline could establish chronological connections. And suddenly, what had once looked like a collection of isolated tragedies began to resemble one continuous story. A story investigators had been trying to understand for years. The East Harlem neighborhood had changed during that period. Buildings changed. Families moved. Children grew older. Businesses opened and closed. People who had once lived on the same block eventually disappeared from the neighborhood. But the cases remained. Names remained. Photographs remained. Police reports remained. And inside evidence rooms, biological samples remained. That was the strange power of forensic science. Time could pass outside. Inside a sealed evidence package, time could almost stop. A biological sample collected years earlier could wait for technology to become sophisticated enough to identify the person who left it behind. That is essentially what happened in the Key investigation. The evidence had been there. The answer had not. Then the answer arrived. And once it arrived, investigators could revisit the past with new certainty. For the families of the victims, however, the scientific breakthrough carried a complicated emotion. There was relief. There was anger. There was grief. There was the knowledge that the person responsible had finally been identified. But there was also a painful question. Why did it take so long? Why had the killer remained free? Why had the family been forced to wait? Why had another young woman been attacked before investigators could finally make the connection? Those questions have no simple answers. Crime investigations are rarely clean. They are built from fragments. A detective receives a report. A witness gives a statement. A laboratory processes evidence. Another detective notices a similarity. A file is reopened. A suspect appears, then disappears. An opportunity is missed. Another opportunity arrives. Sometimes the difference between an unsolved crime and a solved crime is not intelligence. It is timing. In Key's case, timing mattered enormously. The investigation was unfolding during a period when DNA technology was rapidly becoming more powerful. Forensic laboratories were learning how to extract more information from smaller biological samples. Police departments were learning how genetic profiles could be compared across cases. The criminal justice system was beginning to understand that DNA could function almost like a fingerprint, not visible, not physical in the traditional sense, but extraordinarily powerful when properly collected and analyzed. That technological transformation occurred alongside the investigation, and Key became one of the cases demonstrating just how significant that transformation could be. The breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession. It did not come from a killer walking into a police station and admitting everything. It came from surveillance, patience, evidence, and science. Investigators watched Key because they believed he was connected to the crimes. They knew they needed a sample. They waited for him to provide one indirectly. And when the opportunity came, the laboratory could do what investigators had been unable to do through questioning alone. It could compare. The result was decisive. The genetic profile associated with Key matched biological evidence connected to the crimes. For detectives who had spent years following fragments, the result must have been extraordinary. A suspicion had become evidence. But the case did not stop there. Investigators now had to prove what the evidence meant. A DNA match does not, by itself, tell a jury the entire story of a crime. It does not explain why the victim was attacked. It does not describe what happened inside a building. It does not automatically establish every detail of a murder. That is why the prosecution had to build the case piece by piece. Every victim mattered. Every witness mattered. Every location mattered. Every piece of physical evidence mattered. The DNA became one of the strongest links in the chain. But the chain itself had to be presented. And when the case finally reached court, years of investigative work came with it. For the public, the trial offered a shocking transformation. The man whose name had once appeared in police files was now sitting inside a courtroom. The streets of East Harlem were replaced by courtroom walls. The police surveillance was replaced by testimony. The laboratory reports were brought into legal proceedings. The surviving victims faced the accused, and the families waited. For them, the trial was not entertainment. It was a moment when the state was asked to answer a simple but enormous question. Was this the man responsible? The prosecution said yes. The evidence was presented. The defense challenged it. The jury listened. And then came the verdict. Guilty. For years, the investigation had existed in uncertainty. Now the uncertainty had ended in a courtroom. But there was something else happening beyond the verdict. The case was becoming part of a much larger transformation in American criminal investigation. DNA was beginning to change the meaning of a cold case. Before modern forensic databases and widespread DNA testing, a case could become dormant because investigators had exhausted the evidence available to them. A suspect might never be identified. A witness might disappear. A memory might become unreliable. A physical clue might seem useless. But DNA created another possibility. The case could wait for technology. That idea would eventually change thousands of investigations across the United States. Evidence collected in one decade could be tested in another. A suspect who had escaped identification could eventually be linked to a crime. A person convicted of one offense could be compared against evidence from another. And an investigation that appeared finished could suddenly become active again. The Key case demonstrated that possibility with devastating clarity. The killer had not been discovered because investigators simply found a forgotten note. He was exposed because science created a bridge between separate crimes. The biological evidence became the bridge. One side was the crime. The other side was a suspect. And connecting them was a genetic profile. But even after the conviction, questions remained. How many cases had never been connected? How many victims had never been identified? How many crimes committed during those years had no biological evidence preserved? Those are the questions that haunt every serial investigation. Because a known offender creates an uncomfortable possibility. There may have been more. The confirmed crimes are the crimes investigators can prove. They are not necessarily every crime the offender committed. That distinction is important. It is also one reason investigators continue reviewing old cases long after conviction. A murder may have occurred in another neighborhood. A sexual assault may have been reported under a different set of circumstances. A victim may have been too frightened to speak. A case may have been classified differently. The same offender can appear in several police files without anyone immediately recognizing the connection, until DNA brings the files together. That was the power of the profile associated with Key. It allowed investigators to ask questions they could not previously answer. Was the same man present here? Was the same biological signature found there? Could evidence collected years earlier be compared with the new profile? Every comparison carried the possibility of another connection. And every connection carried another human story. The public often remembers serial murder cases through the name of the offender, but investigators remember the victims. That distinction matters. A killer can become famous because of what he did. A victim becomes a name because someone loved her. Paula Ilera was someone's daughter. Johalis Castro was someone's daughter. Rashida Washington was someone's daughter. The surviving victims had families too. They had lives before the crimes. Plans. Friends. School. Work. Dreams. The crime did not create their identities. It interrupted them. That is why the eventual conviction could never truly be described as an ending. It was a legal conclusion, not an emotional one. For the families, there would always be birthdays that never happened, holidays with an empty chair, photographs that stopped at a certain age, questions that could not be answered by a laboratory. The verdict could say who was responsible. It could not restore what had been lost. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part of the story. The evidence that finally exposed Key was almost invisible. A microscopic trace. A biological signature. Something no one could see with the naked eye. Yet that tiny trace eventually carried the weight of years. Years of investigation. Years of fear. Years of unanswered questions. It reached backward through the timeline and pulled the past into the courtroom. That is why the case remained significant. Not because the killer was mysterious forever. He was not. Not because the crimes were never solved. They were. The significance lies in the transformation. A case that had once depended on human memory became a case that could be tested scientifically. A suspect who could deny allegations could be compared against biological evidence. A trail that had disappeared into time could suddenly become visible again. The evidence had been waiting. And when investigators finally had the right profile, it was ready to speak. Outside the courtroom, East Harlem continued living. Cars moved through the streets. People walked past the buildings. Children played. Businesses opened. The city continued its endless motion. But for the families touched by the crimes, time moved differently. Some wounds do not close simply because a jury announces a verdict. Some memories do not fade because a prison door closes. And some questions remain long after the legal system has finished speaking. What might have happened if the connection had been made earlier? What if the technology had existed in 1991? What if investigators had possessed the same forensic tools years before? No one can answer those questions. History does not offer alternate timelines. There is only what happened. A 13-year-old girl disappeared. Years passed. Other women were attacked. Other lives were destroyed. The evidence accumulated. The investigation continued. And eventually, the invisible signature was found. Aaron Key was arrested. The evidence was tested. The courtroom heard the case. The jury returned guilty verdicts. And a neighborhood that had lived with fear for years finally knew the name behind the crimes. But the case also left behind a warning that would become increasingly important as forensic technology advanced. Never assume that an old case is truly silent. Never assume that evidence is useless simply because it could not produce an answer at the time. And never assume that time automatically protects a criminal. Because sometimes time works in the opposite direction. The years can improve the science. The databases can grow. The laboratories can become more sophisticated. Investigators can revisit old evidence. And a crime committed long ago can suddenly produce the answer everyone had been waiting for. That is what happened here. The killer believed the years were behind him. The evidence proved otherwise. The streets had changed. The witnesses had aged. The headlines had faded. But the biological trace remained. And when investigators finally placed that trace against the right name, the distance between 1991 and 1999 disappeared. 8 years became one chain, one investigation, one genetic profile, one courtroom, and one verdict. For the victims, the years can never be returned. For the families, the grief can never be erased. But the truth, once hidden, was no longer hidden. And that is the final power of forensic evidence. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It does not chase. It simply remains, waiting until someone knows how to read it. The evidence remained. And that was precisely what made the case so difficult to forget. Long after police lights disappeared from the streets, long after the newspaper photographs faded, long after detectives moved on to other investigations, the evidence connected to victims remained inside the criminal justice system. It waited in envelopes. It waited in laboratories. It waited in evidence rooms. And years later, when investigators finally had the genetic profile of Aaron Key, those old pieces of evidence suddenly became important again. The investigation was no longer moving forward in a straight line. It was moving backward. Detectives were walking into the past. They were reopening files that had once seemed impossible to solve. They were reading statements written years earlier. They were examining photographs. They were reviewing locations. And most importantly, they were asking whether the same biological signature appeared in crimes that had occurred long before Key's arrest. This was the point when the investigation became bigger than a single murder. It became a question of chronology. How far back did the trail go? How many crimes could be connected? And how long had the same man been moving through East Harlem without being identified? The answers were disturbing. The first confirmed murder connected to Key had occurred years before the final investigation came together. Paula Ilera was only 13. Her death had left behind a family searching for answers and investigators searching for a killer. At the time, however, the tools available to detectives were limited compared with what would come later. There was no modern nationwide DNA database capable of instantly comparing biological evidence against millions of profiles. There was no guarantee that evidence collected in one case could immediately reveal its connection to another. The technology was developing. The investigation was developing. And the killer was moving through the gap between them. That gap became one of the defining elements of the case. For years, investigators could have the right suspect without having the evidence necessary to prove it. That is one of the cruelest realities of criminal investigation. A detective can believe someone is responsible. A survivor can identify someone. A pattern can appear obvious. But a courtroom requires more. The state must prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. That means evidence, corroboration, witnesses, forensic analysis, a coherent timeline, and every part must survive scrutiny. Key's case eventually reached that threshold, but getting there required years of work. Investigators did not simply discover a DNA profile and walk directly into a courtroom. They built the case slowly. The surviving victims played a crucial role. Their accounts helped investigators understand behavior of the attacker. They provided descriptions. They identified details about locations. They helped establish patterns. And their testimony gave human meaning to evidence that otherwise existed only as laboratory numbers. That combination was powerful. A DNA profile can identify a biological source. It cannot tell a jury what a victim felt when she realized she was in danger. It cannot describe the terror of being followed. It cannot explain the psychological damage that continues long after physical injuries heal. That is why these cases are never purely scientific. The laboratory can provide certainty about biological evidence. The courtroom must still confront the human story. And the human story surrounding Aaron Key was devastating. Young women were targeted. Some survived. Some did not. Families were left with questions. And the community was forced to confront the possibility that the person responsible was not some distant stranger. He was someone who knew the neighborhood. Someone who could move through familiar streets. Someone who could disappear into ordinary life. That is what makes serial offenders so difficult to detect. They do not necessarily announce themselves. They do not always behave suspiciously. They can maintain jobs, friendships, relationships, daily routines. They can stand among everyone else. And while everyone is looking for a monster, the offender can look completely ordinary. Key's investigation revealed how dangerous that illusion could be. The name Ace circulated. But a nickname does not prove a murder. A rumor does not prove a rape. A suspicion does not prove a homicide. The investigators needed something stronger. They needed the science. And when that science finally arrived, the investigation changed speed. The genetic profile gave detectives a tool that could not be influenced by changing memories. It could not be intimidated. It could not forget. It could not suddenly decide that yesterday's events had happened differently. The biological evidence either matched or it did not. That binary quality gave investigators something they desperately needed: certainty. But even then, the work continued. Every piece of evidence had to be documented. Every sample had to be handled correctly. Every laboratory result had to be interpreted. Every connection had to be presented in court. The process was painstaking. And for the families, it must have felt painfully slow. There is a strange contradiction in long investigations. For detectives, time can be an ally. For families, time can feel like punishment. Every year without an answer creates another year of uncertainty. A birthday passes. Another anniversary arrives. Another Christmas. Another year when the missing chair at the table remains empty. The calendar keeps moving. The investigation may not, until something changes. In the Key case, that change was DNA. And once the DNA pointed toward him, the investigation began pulling together pieces that had been scattered for years. One of those pieces was the murder of Jo Hollis Castro. She was 19. Her body was discovered inside the George Washington houses in September 1997. The location mattered. It was not an isolated wilderness. It was a residential environment, a place filled with people, a place where footsteps, elevators, doors, and voices were part of everyday life. Yet the crime happened anyway. And afterward, investigators were left with the enormous task of reconstructing the victim's final movements. Who had seen her? Who had spoken to her? Who had been near the building? Who had access? Who had a reason to hurt her? And what evidence had the killer left behind? The investigation eventually focused attention on Key. But suspicion alone could not close the case. The same problem appeared again. The police needed proof. That proof eventually came from the biological evidence. And once the DNA evidence was connected to Key, the old questions acquired new significance. Investigators could reconsider his movements. They could reconsider his relationships. They could reconsider statements he had made. They could compare physical evidence with the new genetic profile. The case was no longer a collection of possibilities. It was becoming a structure, and every new piece of evidence strengthened it. Then came Rashida Washington, 18 years old, found dead in 1998. Another young woman. Another East Harlem location. Another sexual assault. Another strangulation. Another family devastated. By this point, the similarities were impossible to ignore. The crimes had a common geography. They involved similar forms of violence. And biological evidence was creating a connection that investigators could not explain away. The killer was not simply operating randomly. The cases were linked. And if they were linked, then the question became even more frightening. How many victims had been exposed to the same danger? The investigation had moved beyond solving one homicide. It was now about dismantling an entire pattern. That pattern had existed for years. And while detectives worked to reconstruct it, Key was no longer free. His arrest in Florida had stopped his immediate movements. But it also created an opportunity for investigators to examine everything they had. The manhunt had ended. The forensic investigation had accelerated. The courtroom case was coming together. Yet one of the most important elements remained outside the police files. The victims themselves. Their voices. Their memories. Their ability to stand in court and confront the person accused of destroying their lives. For survivors, a trial can be another form of trauma. The past is reopened. Questions are asked. Details are repeated. The defense challenges memories. Prosecutors reconstruct the worst moments of a person's life in front of strangers. And the accused sits nearby. For a survivor, justice can require reliving the crime. That reality is easy to overlook when a case is reduced to headlines. Serial killer arrested. DNA leads to suspect. Conviction secured. But behind those headlines are people who had to survive the years between the crime and the courtroom. That period can be longer than the public realizes. And in this case, it was measured in years. The investigation began in the early 1990s. The decisive arrest came in 1999. The conviction followed in 2000. Nearly a decade had passed since the first murder. Nearly a decade in which families waited. Nearly a decade in which investigators continued searching. Nearly a decade in which technology changed. And then, suddenly, the past became evidence. That is why the Aaron Key case remains an important example of the power of forensic investigation. The killer was not discovered because he suddenly became careless in some spectacular way. He was exposed because investigators patiently followed evidence until science could make the connection. That distinction matters. Criminal investigations are often portrayed as moments of brilliance. A detective sees one clue. A suspect confesses. The mystery is solved. Reality is usually different. It is repetitive. It is frustrating. It is paperwork. It is surveillance. It is laboratory testing. It is interviews. It is waiting. And sometimes it is doing the same thing again because the first attempt produced nothing. The Key investigation followed that reality. Investigators watched him. They sought biological evidence. They waited for an opportunity. And eventually, the opportunity came. The discarded cup became more than an object. It became a bridge. A bridge between the suspect and the evidence. A bridge between 1999 and crimes committed years earlier. A bridge between suspicion and prosecution. That is why such a small piece of evidence can have enormous consequences. The object itself is meaningless without context. A cup is just a cup. Saliva is just biological material. A laboratory number is just a number. But when the laboratory number matches biological evidence recovered from a crime scene, everything changes. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The invisible becomes decisive. And the past begins speaking. For investigators, that was the moment the case stopped being a mystery. For the families, however, the mystery had already cost too much. There is no scientific test that can measure grief. There is no DNA profile that can reconstruct a childhood. There is no courtroom verdict that can return a murdered daughter to her parents. The justice system can identify the offender. It can punish him. It can establish facts. But it cannot reverse time. That is why the conclusion of the Key case carries two different meanings. Legally, there was an ending. The suspect was identified. He was prosecuted. He was convicted. He was sentenced. But emotionally, there was no clean ending. The victims remained victims. The survivors remained survivors. The families remained families who had lost someone. And East Harlem remained a community that had lived through years of fear. The case, therefore, became more than a story about one man. It became a story about what happens when science catches up with violence. A crime can be forgotten by the public. It can disappear from newspapers. It can become one more file among thousands. But if biological evidence survives, the crime may never truly disappear. The evidence can wait. Technology can improve. Databases can expand. Investigators can return. And one day, the answer can emerge from something collected years earlier. That possibility changed American policing. Cold cases were no longer necessarily frozen forever. They could be reopened, re-examined, retested, reconstructed, and sometimes solved. The Aaron Key investigation demonstrated that transformation at a moment when DNA was becoming one of the most powerful tools available to investigators. It showed that time did not necessarily erase evidence. Sometimes time gave science the opportunity to understand it. And that may be the most unsettling thought left behind by the case. A killer can walk away from a crime scene. He can change his appearance. He can move to another neighborhood. He can deny the accusation. He can refuse a DNA test. He can wait years. But he cannot control every molecule he leaves behind. He cannot erase every trace. He cannot command biological evidence to disappear. And he cannot know exactly what investigators will be capable of proving 10 years later. That is a shadow that follows every unsolved crime. The evidence may already exist. The answer may already be somewhere inside a laboratory. The name may already be waiting inside a database. The only missing element may be the technology capable of connecting them. In East Harlem, that connection eventually arrived. And when it did, years of uncertainty collapsed. Aaron Key was no longer a name investigators were watching. He was a man prosecutors would put on trial. The victims were no longer cases without answers. Their stories became part of prosecution. The biological evidence was no longer merely evidence. It became a voice that could not be silenced. And after years of silence, it finally told investigators where to look. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The past had not disappeared. It had been waiting inside evidence boxes, police reports, laboratory records, and memories that refused to disappear with time. And once investigators knew what they were looking for, the past began to reveal itself. The arrest of Aaron Key had created certainty where there had once been suspicion, but also exposed the uncomfortable reality of how long the investigation had remained incomplete. The crimes were not committed in some distant, isolated world. They happened in New York City, inside a community where people went to work. Children went to school, and families knew their neighbors. The victims had lived ordinary lives. That was what made the violence so devastating. Nothing about their daily routines suggested that they were walking to the final hours of their lives. A teenager leaves home. A young woman enters an apartment building. Someone walks through a stairwell. A door closes. A stranger becomes a familiar face. And somewhere inside those ordinary moments, the course of life can change forever. For investigators reconstructing the crimes years later, those ordinary details became crucial. Where had each victim been? Who had seen her? What time had she disappeared? Who had access to the building? What physical evidence had remained? And most importantly, could the same offender have been present in more than one case? The DNA evidence provided the strongest answer, but investigators still needed to understand the human pattern behind it. Serial offenders rarely leave behind identical crime scenes. They adapt. They change locations. They change their methods. They take different risks. That can make a series of crimes appear unrelated. But beneath those differences, certain behaviors may remain. The selection of victims, the geographic area, the circumstances surrounding contact, the type of physical violence, the use of familiar surroundings. And in the Key investigation, those connections became increasingly difficult to dismiss. East Harlem was not simply the backdrop. It was part of the pattern. Key knew the neighborhood. He understood its buildings. He understood how people moved through them. He could exist in the same environment as his victims without immediately attracting attention. That familiarity created opportunity. And opportunity is one of the most important elements in understanding serial crime. The offender does not need control an entire city. He needs only to understand a small section of it. A street, a building, a hallway, a staircase, a route home, a place where a victim can become isolated. That knowledge can be more dangerous than any weapon, because it allows an offender to predict where people will be. The investigation into Key gradually revealed how important location was. The crimes were not scattered randomly across the country. They were concentrated around an environment he knew, and that geographic consistency helped investigators connect what had once seemed separate. Still, the case was not solved by geography. It was solved through the convergence of evidence. That distinction mattered. A suspect living near a crime scene does not prove guilt. A person knowing a victim does not prove guilt. A witness identifying a suspect can be important, but memory can be challenged. A pattern can be suggestive, but prosecutors still need proof. DNA changed the equation because it added a forensic connection. And when multiple forms of evidence point toward the same individual, the case becomes substantially stronger. That was the architecture prosecutors eventually presented. The victims, the witnesses, the physical evidence, the investigative history, and the DNA. Each piece stood independently. Together, they created a narrative that became increasingly difficult to escape. But before that narrative reached the courtroom, investigators had to make sure the evidence could withstand scrutiny. Forensic science is not simply about obtaining a match. It is about how that match was obtained. Where was the sample collected? Who handled it? How was it stored? How was it transported? Which laboratory examined it? How was the profile generated? How was the comparison conducted? Every stage matters. A biological sample can be extraordinarily powerful, but only when investigators can establish that it was properly collected and analyzed. The prosecution, therefore, had to translate complicated forensic procedures into language a jury could understand. The science had to become understandable without losing its accuracy. That was especially important because DNA evidence can appear almost magical to people who do not understand how it works. But there is no magic. There is biology. There are genetic markers. There are laboratory procedures. There are statistical calculations. And there is evidence that can be compared. In the key case, the science became the bridge between separate events. That bridge stretched across years. At one end was a crime committed when investigators did not know the offender's identity. At the other end was a suspect whose DNA profile could be tested against preserved evidence. Between those points was almost a decade. The passage of time had not destroyed the connection. It had merely delayed it. And that delay had consequences. Every year the investigation remained unresolved was another year in which the families did not know the complete truth. Another year in which the surviving victims had to live with uncertainty. Another year in which the offender could live outside prison. That is why cold cases are so emotionally complicated. To an investigator, an old case can be an unfinished assignment. To a family, it is an unfinished life. There is no deadline for grief. There is no expiration date on a missing answer. And when a case finally moves forward years later, the emotions can be overwhelming. Relief can exist beside anger. Justice can exist beside grief. Certainty can exist beside questions that will never be answered. For the victims of the key investigation, those emotions became part of the aftermath. The conviction provided legal accountability, but it could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not return Paula Ilera to her family. It could not erase what happened to Johalis Castro. It could not undo the death of Rashida Washington. And it could not erase the memories carried by survivors. The courtroom could establish facts. It could not rewrite history. That is why the final verdict should never be mistaken for a happy ending. It was a conclusion to a criminal prosecution. Nothing more. The real ending for the victims had already occurred years earlier. Their lives had been interrupted. The trial could only establish responsibility for what followed. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case was the length of time between those two moments. The first murder. The final conviction. Almost a decade of history stood between them. During that time, the world changed. Technology changed. New forensic techniques emerged. Police departments became more familiar with DNA. Investigators learned to think differently about biological evidence. And the criminal justice system began entering a new era. The concept of a cold case was changing. An old case was no longer necessarily an abandoned case. It could be a case waiting for better science. That idea would become enormously important in the years that followed. Investigators across the country began revisiting evidence collected decades earlier. Old sexual assault kits were reopened. Unidentified remains were tested. Archived biological samples were compared against new profiles. And suspects who had believed themselves safe because years had passed discovered that time could work against them. Aaron Key's case became part of that transformation. It showed how evidence preserved from an earlier crime could become powerful when investigators finally had a suspect's genetic profile. It showed how separate cases could be connected. And it showed why evidence preservation matters. Because no investigator can know what technology will look like 10 years from now. An object that seems insignificant today may become decisive tomorrow. A biological sample that produces no answer may become identifiable with a more advanced laboratory technique. A database that does not exist today may contain millions of profiles in the future. That is the logic behind modern cold case investigation. Do not assume that an unanswered case has no future. Sometimes the future is the missing piece. For Key, however, that future arrived while he was still alive and still within reach of investigators. He had not disappeared permanently. He had been identified, tracked, arrested, and prosecuted. The manhunt that once seemed uncertain ended in Miami. The courtroom that followed was in New York. But the real battlefield had been built years earlier inside the evidence. Every preserved sample represented question. Every laboratory test represented an attempt to answer it. And every match represented another connection in the chain. This is why the image of a discarded cup remains so striking. There was no dramatic confession attached to it. No handwritten note. No threatening message. No grand gesture. Just an ordinary object. Something that could have been thrown away without a second thought. Yet investigators understood that ordinary objects can become extraordinary evidence. A suspect can control what he says. He can control whether he cooperates. He can control where he goes. But he cannot completely control what his body leaves behind. Skin cells, hair, blood, saliva. Biological traces can remain after the person has gone. That reality transformed the relationship between criminals and evidence. In earlier decades, a suspect might believe that leaving a scene meant leaving the evidence behind. Modern forensic science introduced a different idea. Leaving the scene can mean leaving yourself behind. The killer walks away. The biological signature stays. And if investigators preserve it, the evidence can wait. That concept is simple. Its consequences are enormous. It is also why the Aaron Key investigation is remembered not only as a murder prosecution, but as a forensic milestone in the changing era of criminal investigation. The case demonstrated how traditional police work and modern science could reinforce each other. Detectives gathered information. Witnesses provided memories. Investigators established connections. Laboratories provided genetic evidence. Prosecutors assembled the case. And the jury evaluated the whole picture. No single component existed in isolation. The strength came from convergence. That is how major investigations are often solved. Not through one brilliant clue. Through dozens of smaller pieces finally pointing in the same direction. The public sees the moment of arrest. Investigators remember everything that came before it. The interviews. The surveillance. The evidence logs. The laboratory reports. The late nights. The unanswered questions, the repeated searches, the cases that refused to disappear, and eventually the moment when the pieces aligned. For the East Harlem community, the alignment brought a different kind of silence. The fear that had once been attached to an unknown predator now had a name. People could understand who had been accused. They could understand why investigators believed the crimes were connected. And they could finally see the criminal justice system move toward a conclusion. But knowing the name did not erase the memories. The streets remained. The buildings remained. The places where the victims had lived remained. And for people who knew those locations, the geography of the crimes could never again feel completely ordinary. A stairwell is just a stairwell. A housing project is just a housing project. A neighborhood street is just a street, until something terrible happens there. Then the location becomes part of memory. Every generation of investigators inherits those memories. They study old cases. They learn from earlier mistakes. They examine what worked. They examine what failed. And they carry those lessons into the next investigation. The Aaron Key case offered one of those lessons with extraordinary clarity. Do not underestimate biological evidence. Do not assume that an old crime is beyond resolution. Do not assume that a suspect's refusal to cooperate means the investigation is over. And do not underestimate the patience required to solve a case that has remained unanswered for years. The investigation moved slowly, but it did not stop. That distinction matters. Slow is not the same as dead. Unsolved is not the same as forgotten. And silent evidence is not the same as useless evidence. The biological material remained. The files remained. The memories remained. And eventually they converged. The case that began with a 13-year-old girl's disappearance ultimately became part of a larger story about forensic science and the power of evidence preserved through time. The final verdict could close the courtroom proceedings, but the lessons continued. For investigators, the case demonstrated the importance of connecting crimes through evidence rather than assumptions. For forensic scientists, it demonstrated the value of biological material preserved from earlier investigations. For families, it demonstrated that an unanswered question can remain alive for years. And for criminals, it offered a warning that would become increasingly difficult to ignore. Time is not guaranteed protection. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes every passing year gives investigators better tools, better databases, better laboratories, better ways to compare evidence, and eventually better answers. The man may believe that the case belongs to the past, but the evidence does not know what year it is. It simply waits. A sample collected in 1991 remains a sample. A sample collected in 1997 remains a sample. A sample collected in 1998 remains a sample. And when those samples are finally compared against the right genetic profile, years can collapse into seconds. That is what makes the story of Aaron Keyes so unsettling. The investigation did not end because the past disappeared. It ended because the past finally became readable. And once the evidence could be read, the name behind the crimes could no longer remain hidden. The streets had moved on. The city had changed. The headlines had faded. But inside the evidence, the story had never stopped. It was waiting for someone to find the connection. And when investigators finally did, nearly a decade of uncertainty came crashing into present. The killer had been there all along. The evidence had been there too. The difference was that now, investigators knew how to make the two speak to each other. The difference was that now, investigators knew how to make the two speak to each other. And once they did, the investigation entered its most consequential stage. The question was no longer whether Aaron Keyes' name belonged in the files. It was whether the evidence could withstand a courtroom. That distinction mattered because an arrest is not a conviction. A DNA match can redirect an investigation. It can identify a suspect. It can change the entire theory of a case. But eventually, the evidence must be presented to people who were not inside the investigation. A jury. Ordinary citizens. People who had not spent years reading police reports. People who had not watched the surveillance. People who had not stood inside the crime scenes. They had to hear the story and decide whether the prosecution had proved its case. That meant the years of investigation had to be reconstructed. The prosecution had to take events that had occurred years apart and place them into one coherent timeline. 1991, 1992, 1993, 1994, 1995. Each year carried another piece of the story. Each victim carried another part of the truth, and each piece of forensic evidence had to be explained. The challenge was enormous, because the case was not about one night. It was about a pattern. The first victim was a 13-year-old girl. The later victims were older. Some survived. Some did not. The locations differed. The circumstances were not identical. But the biological evidence created a connection that traditional investigation had struggled to establish. That connection became the spine of the prosecution. And behind the science were the victims, people who had existed long before they became names in police reports. Paula had been a child. Joe Hollies had been 19. Rashida had been 18. The surviving victims had their own lives and futures. Their identities could easily have been reduced to statistics. But statistics do not cry. Statistics do not wait by a telephone. Statistics do not sit at a kitchen table and stare at an empty chair. Families do. That is what a criminal investigation can sometimes hide. The police file is full of facts. The family is full of memories. The two worlds meet in court. The prosecutor says what happened. The evidence shows what happened. The witness remembers what happened. And the family listens. For the people closest to the victims, the trial was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a public reconstruction of private trauma. Every detail that appeared in evidence had already been lived once. The courtroom forced those moments into the open again. That is one reason surviving victims are so important. Their testimony provides something forensic evidence cannot: context. DNA may establish that a biological trace came from a particular individual. A survivor can explain how that individual entered her life, what happened, what the attacker said, what the victim saw, what she remembered, and what she survived. Together, the scientific and human evidence created a much fuller picture. The defense had the right to challenge it. That is how the legal system is supposed to work. Evidence is tested. Witnesses are questioned. Scientific conclusions are examined. Investigators can be challenged about procedure. The jury does not simply accept a police theory. It must decide whether the evidence meets the legal standard. That process can feel frustrating to families who have waited years for justice. But it is essential, because the consequence of a murder conviction is permanent. The evidence must be strong enough to justify it. In Key's case, prosecutors believe they had that evidence. The DNA, the witness testimony, the investigative connections, the physical evidence, the history, and, eventually, the jury agreed. The verdict closed one chapter. But the investigation had already changed the way detectives understood the past. They could now look at old evidence with a known suspect in mind. That is a powerful investigative advantage. Before identification, every unknown biological profile is simply an unknown. After identification, the same profile becomes a potential link. The question changes from, who left this evidence, to, is this Key? That sounds like a small difference. It is not. It can transform thousands of investigative decisions. Evidence that once seemed unrelated can be tested. Old files can be reopened. Unsolved assaults can be reconsidered. Investigators can search for patterns they could not previously see. And this is where the case becomes particularly important from a historical perspective. The 1990s were a transitional period in forensic investigation. DNA technology was becoming increasingly reliable and useful. Law enforcement agencies were beginning to understand its potential. But the infrastructure was still developing. Evidence was not always collected with the expectations investigators have today. Not every case produced a usable sample. Not every sample was tested immediately. And not every laboratory had the same capabilities. That meant an enormous amount of evidence existed in a kind of forensic limbo. It had been collected. It had been stored. But it had not yet been fully understood. The Key investigation showed what could happen when technology finally caught up. An old case could become new again. The past could become actionable. The investigation could move backward through time. That is why cold cases are often described incorrectly. People sometimes imagine a cold case as a case where nothing remains. Often the opposite is true. A cold case can contain enormous amounts of evidence. What is missing is a connection. A fingerprint without a known suspect. A photograph without an identification. A biological sample without a matching profile. A witness statement without corroboration. A name without proof. The investigator's task is to create the connection. DNA can sometimes create that connection almost instantly, but sometimes it takes years. In the Key investigation, it took years. And while the science was developing, the victims' families were living through the consequences. Every anniversary brought the case back. Every new detective assigned to file had to learn the history. Every change in technology created another possibility. Could the evidence be tested again? Could another crime be connected? Could another victim finally receive an answer? Those questions are what keep cold case investigations alive. Not the headlines. Not the fascination. The victims. Because every unanswered case represents a life interrupted without a complete explanation. That is why investigators continue reopening old evidence even when public attention has disappeared. The families have not forgotten. And neither has the evidence. The Aaron Key case demonstrates that principle with unusual force. The investigation did not depend on a single dramatic discovery. It depended on persistence. Detectives continued following the suspect. They continued seeking biological evidence. They continued examining old crimes. They continued working even when direct cooperation was unavailable. Key refused to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. That did not end the investigation. Instead, detectives watched for an opportunity to obtain evidence that he had abandoned. The discarded cup became crucial. It was an object Key had no reason to believe would become part of a murder investigation. But it did. And that is one of the strange realities of forensic science. The most important evidence may look completely meaningless at the moment it is discovered. A cigarette butt, a glass, a piece of clothing, a strand of hair, a smear, a drop of blood, an object touched briefly and forgotten. The offender leaves. The evidence remains. And if investigators recognize its value, the object can become the key to an entire investigation. That is what happened with Key. The biological material recovered from the cup provided the profile investigators needed. Once that profile matched evidence from the crimes, the case moved from suspicion to scientific identification. The manhunt that followed demonstrated another important reality. Even after the evidence points toward a suspect, investigators still have to locate him. Key fled New York with Angelique Stallings. The investigation became urgent. A suspect connected to multiple violent crimes was moving with a teenage girl. Detectives needed to find them. The trail led to Florida. The geography changed. The stakes did not. The eventual arrest in Miami ended the immediate search. But it also began another phase. The legal phase. The evidence phase. The trial. The sentence. The long process of turning investigative conclusions into judicial findings. That process matters because criminal justice is not simply about knowing the truth. It is about proving the truth according to established rules. The police may believe a suspect is guilty. The prosecutor may believe it. The victim may believe it. But the court requires evidence. That is why the DNA evidence was so significant. It provided a form of proof that did not depend solely on belief. It could be examined. It could be explained. It could be challenged. And ultimately, it could be considered alongside the other evidence. When the jury returned guilty verdicts in 2000, the case reached its legal conclusion. But even then, investigators continued examining older crimes. That is where the story takes another disturbing turn. The DNA profile did not simply explain the murders already known. It could potentially illuminate other cases. And in 2004, DNA evidence connected Key to a rape committed in 1994. That case had been waiting for years. The evidence had survived. The victim had survived. And the investigation now had a suspect profile against which to compare the biological material. The connection was established. Key eventually acknowledged responsibility for the rape. Another case had been brought into the light. Another victim had an answer. Another file could finally be closed. But that development also revealed the broader reach of the investigation. The crimes associated with Key were not confined to the cases that had initially attracted the most attention. The forensic evidence allowed investigators to look further. That is one of the most important functions of DNA in serial crime investigations. It can expand the investigation beyond what detectives already suspect. Instead of asking whether evidence supports a theory, investigators can allow the evidence to reveal unexpected connections. A biological profile can expose links between cases that occurred years apart. The same offender may have attacked different victims who never knew one another. The victims may have lived in different parts of the city. The crimes may have been reported to different detectives. But the DNA can reveal that the same person was present. That is the power of a genetic profile. It does not understand geography. It does not understand time. It simply records biological identity. And when investigators compare profiles, patterns emerge. For East Harlem, those patterns told a horrifying story. Young women were being targeted. The crimes were connected. The offender had remained free for years. And the evidence had been waiting to reveal him. The case therefore became a lesson in patience. Not passive patience. Investigative patience. The kind that means continuing to look after the obvious answers have failed. Continuing to test after the first test produces nothing. Continuing to ask questions after the headlines have disappeared. Continuing to preserve evidence even when no suspect is known. That patience eventually paid off. But it came too late for those who had already died. That is a contradiction at the heart of every successful cold case investigation. The case is solved. But the crime remains. The offender is convicted. But the victim remains dead. The family receives answers. But not the person they wanted back. Justice can move forward. Time cannot. And that is why the story of Aaron Key should not be remembered merely as the story of a killer caught by DNA. It should be remembered as the story of victims whose cases refused to disappear. The evidence survived because someone collected it. The files survived because someone preserved them. The investigation survived because detectives continued asking questions. And when technology finally provided the missing connection, the truth emerged. The evidence did not suddenly appear. It had been there, waiting, for years. And once it spoke, the silence surrounding the case could not last forever. The silence surrounding the case could not last forever. But silence had been part of the investigation for years. It lived in the unanswered questions. It lived in the photographs kept inside police files. It lived in the memories of detectives who had never forgotten the faces of the victims. And it lived inside the families who had learned to carry grief without an explanation. When Aaron Key was finally identified, that silence was broken. But another question immediately took its place. How had he remained undetected for so long? The answer was not simple. There was no single mistake. No single failed interview. No single piece of evidence that investigators had ignored. Instead, the case reflected the reality of criminal investigations before DNA technology became as powerful and widespread as it is today. Investigators had fragments. They had pieces. They had suspicions. But they did not yet have the bridge connecting them. And without that bridge, separate crimes can remain separate for years. That is what happened in East Harlem. A young woman could be attacked in one building. Another could disappear somewhere else. A third could be found dead. The circumstances might look similar, but similarity is not proof. Detectives needed something that could physically connect the crimes. The biological evidence eventually provided that connection. Once investigators had Key's DNA profile, the old cases looked different. The same evidence that had once seemed inconclusive suddenly had a reference point. That is an important distinction in forensic investigation. Evidence does not always change. Sometimes the information surrounding the evidence changes. A sample collected years earlier remains the same sample. What changes is the ability to identify it. And that was the breakthrough. The laboratory did not travel back in time. The technology simply allowed investigators to interpret what had already been preserved. The past was still there. It had simply been waiting for the right question. And once the question became, does this belong to Aaron Key, the investigation could move with extraordinary speed. The answer was yes. That answer transformed the case. It also transformed Key's position. Before the DNA connection, he could be viewed as a suspect. After the DNA connection, prosecutors could argue that he was physically connected to the crimes. The distinction between suspicion and evidence became enormous. But the investigators were not finished. A serial investigation cannot stop at one match. Once a suspect has been identified, detectives must ask what else he may have done. They return to old files. They look for similarities. They review unsolved assaults. They examine cases where the offender was never identified. They search for biological evidence. They compare. And they wait for the next connection. This process can reveal a disturbing reality. The crimes that become famous are not always the only crimes committed. Some victims survive without receiving justice. Some never report what happened. Some cases contain no usable biological evidence. Some evidence is lost. Some evidence deteriorates. Some victims are too frightened to identify their attacker. And some cases simply remain unsolved. That uncertainty surrounded many investigations during the period when Key was active. But once his genetic profile became known, detectives had something they had never possessed before. A way to test the past against a known biological identity. The case involving the 1994 rape demonstrated the significance of that capability. The crime had happened years before Key's arrest. The victim had been forced to carry the memory for years. But the evidence remained. When investigators compare it with Key's DNA, the old case became active again. A crime that had once seemed frozen suddenly had a suspect. And a victim who had once faced uncertainty could finally know who had been responsible. That is one of the quietest but most important consequences of forensic breakthroughs. They do not always make headlines. Sometimes the greatest impact happens privately. A family receives a phone call. A victim is told that the investigation has finally identified the offender. A detective closes a file that had remained open for years. There is no dramatic chase. No television camera. No flashing lights. Just an answer. For families waiting years for that answer, it can mean everything. But answers can also reopen wounds. Because when the identity of a killer becomes known, families may discover details they had never known before. They may learn how their loved one died. They may learn where the crime occurred. They may hear testimony describing the final moments. Knowledge can bring relief. It can also bring pain. There is no universal response to justice. Every family experiences it differently. For the victims connected to Key, the legal process forced the past into public view. The prosecution had to explain the crimes. The defense had to challenge the evidence. The witnesses had to speak. The laboratory findings had to be examined. The jury had to decide, and the accused had to sit through the evidence. The courtroom therefore became a second crime scene of sorts. Not physically, but psychologically. Every piece of evidence reconstructed something that had happened years earlier. The jury was asked to travel backward through time. They had to imagine locations that no longer looked exactly the same. They had to listen to witnesses recalling events from years before. They had to understand forensic evidence generated from biological material collected long earlier. And they had to decide whether all of those pieces pointed toward the same conclusion. They did. Key was convicted. The verdict was a moment of certainty after years of uncertainty. But outside the courtroom, the city continued moving. New York did not stop. The subway continued running. Traffic continued through Manhattan. People walked past buildings without knowing what had happened there. For most residents, life returned to ordinary routines. For the families, ordinary life was no longer possible in quite the same way. Certain places became reminders. Certain dates became painful. Certain names could never be spoken casually again. That is the invisible aftermath of violent crime. The courtroom can establish a legal ending. The emotional aftermath continues indefinitely. And for investigators, another reality remained. There were still unanswered questions. Even when an offender has been convicted of known crimes, detectives must remain cautious about assuming that every unsolved case involving a similar pattern belongs to the same person. Evidence must establish the connection. The law demands proof. That is why forensic science matters so much. It prevents investigators from relying solely on intuition. A detective may recognize a pattern. A prosecutor may believe two cases are connected. But DNA can provide an independent scientific link. That does not make the investigation automatic. It makes it testable. And that difference is fundamental. The key investigation became a model of how several investigative methods could converge. Traditional police work identified potential connections. Surveillance produced an opportunity. Biological evidence provided a profile. Laboratory testing established matches. Witnesses supplied testimony. Prosecutors built the legal case. And the jury made the final decision. No single step solved everything. The solution emerged because the steps reinforce one another. That is often how major criminal investigations work. The public sees a final arrest. The reality is thousands of smaller decisions made before that moment. Someone decides to preserve evidence. Someone decides to reopen a file. Someone notices a similarity. Someone orders another laboratory test. Someone follows a suspect. Someone waits. And eventually, one decision leads to another. The chain becomes stronger. Then the chain reaches a suspect. In Key's case, that chain stretched across years. It began with a 13-year-old girl. It continued through additional assaults and murders. It passed through evidence rooms and police laboratories. It reached a discarded cup. It traveled into a DNA analysis. It moved to Florida. Then it entered courtroom. And finally, it ended with a conviction. But the chain also tells us something darker. Every link represents a human being. Every crime scene represents someone whose life was changed or destroyed. The science may be fascinating. The investigative strategy may be impressive. The legal case may be historically important. But none of that should obscure the victims. The danger of true crime storytelling is that the offender can become the central character. His name becomes a headline. His photograph becomes a thumbnail. His behavior becomes a subject of endless discussion. Meanwhile, the victims can disappear behind the crime. That must not happen. Paula Ilera was not simply a case number. Joe Hawley's Castro was not simply evidence. Rashida Washington was not simply a DNA match. They were young women with families, personalities, relationships, and futures. The surviving victims were not merely witnesses. They were people who endured violence and then had to live with its consequences. Their courage became part of the prosecution. Their memories helped investigators reconstruct what happened. And their willingness to testify helped turn evidence into a story that a jury could understand. The science could identify. The victims could explain. Together, they created the case. That is why the conviction carried significance beyond the punishment of one offender. It demonstrated that a criminal investigation can remain alive even when years have passed. The case did not die when the original investigators reached the limits of available technology. It waited. The evidence waited. And when new forensic capabilities became available, investigators returned. This principle will become increasingly important in the decades that followed. DNA databases expanded. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators gained access to increasingly sophisticated analytical tools. Old evidence could be tested with methods that investigators of the early 1990s could not have imagined. The meaning of a cold case changed. A cold case was no longer necessarily a case without evidence. It could be a case with evidence that had not yet produced an answer. That distinction offered hope. Hope for families. Hope for survivors. Hope for detectives. And fear for offenders who believed time had erased their crimes. Because time does not erase biological evidence simply because a suspect wants it to. The evidence has no sense of guilt, no sense of innocence, no sense of fear. It simply exists. The laboratory interprets it. The courts evaluate it. And when the evidence is strong enough, the truth can emerge. That is what happened with Aaron Key. The years had not protected him. They had merely delayed the moment when investigators could connect him to the evidence. Eventually, the connection became unavoidable. The suspect became the defendant. The defendant became the convicted offender. And the old files finally had an answer. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of the case is not the moment Key was arrested. It is the years before that moment. The years when victims and families did not know. The years when investigators could not prove what they suspected. The years when biological evidence existed without a name. Because that period reveals how fragile justice can be when technology is limited. A detective may know that something is wrong. A family may know that something does not make sense. A survivor may know exactly who attacked her. But without evidence that survives legal scrutiny, certainty can remain out of reach. The Key investigation demonstrates how that barrier can eventually be broken. Not by luck alone. Not by confession. But by persistence and science. A single biological trace became a thread. The thread became a pattern. The pattern became an investigation. The investigation became a prosecution. And the prosecution became a conviction. That transformation took years. But once it began, the past moved rapidly into the present. The case was no longer forgotten. The victims were no longer without answers. And the evidence that had remained silent for so long finally had a voice. It did not speak in words. It spoke through a genetic profile. And that profile was enough to bring a name out of the darkness. The genetic profile had spoken, but the story did not end when the courtroom heard the word guilty. Because a conviction can establish responsibility for a crime, but it cannot explain every question that remains in the minds of investigators, survivors, and families. For years, detectives have been trying to understand the sequence of events that brought young women into the path of the same offender. Now they had the luxury of looking backward with information they had not possessed before. That changed everything. The investigators were no longer staring at an empty map. They had a starting point. Aaron Key. From that point, they could reconstruct movements, relationships, locations, and encounters. They could revisit old statements and compare them with what they now knew. Some details that had once seemed insignificant suddenly mattered. A name mentioned casually in an interview, a location, a piece of clothing, a connection between two people, a biological sample preserved years earlier. The case became a demonstration of how information changes, meaning once investigators know what they're looking for, a detail can sit unnoticed for years. Then one new fact arrives. Suddenly, the detail becomes important. That is exactly what happened with the forensic evidence. Before Key's DNA profile was established, biological material recovered from a crime scene could identify an unknown offender only as an unknown offender. After investigators obtained Key's profile, the same material could be compared against him. The evidence had not changed. The question had. And the answer became devastating. The connection between Key and the crimes gave investigators a clearer understanding of the pattern that had haunted East Harlem. But there was another dimension to the case that could never be reduced to laboratory results. Fear. The victims had lived inside it. So had their families. And so had the community. A serial offender creates a particular kind of fear because the danger appears invisible. People do not know where the next attack will happen. They do not know who is responsible. They do not know whether the attacker is watching them. And when the victims are young women from the same neighborhood, fear can spread faster than facts. Rumors begin. Names circulate. People speculate. Every unfamiliar man can become suspicious. Every stranger can become a possibility. Every unsolved attack can feel like part of the same threat. That atmosphere can change how a neighborhood behaves. People walk faster. Doors close earlier. Parents become more protective. Young women avoid certain routes. And ordinary places acquire new meanings. A staircase is no longer just a staircase. A basement is no longer just a basement. A dark hallway becomes a place where someone might be waiting. That psychological impact is rarely captured in official statistics. Yet it can last long after police identify a suspect. When Key was arrested, the immediate threat was removed, but the memory of the crimes remained. And for some residents, the knowledge that the offender had been moving through their neighborhood for years was itself disturbing. The killer had not been hiding in some distant world. He had been close. That realization can be more frightening than the idea of a stranger, because proximity changes the meaning of safety. People often believe danger is something that comes from outside. A stranger, an outsider, someone who does not belong. Serial crimes can destroy that assumption. The offender may belong to the same community. He may know the same streets. He may recognize the same faces. He may understand the same routines. That familiarity can become camouflage. And once investigators understood Key's connections to the neighborhood, his ability to move unnoticed became easier to understand. But the investigation still required proof. The police could not simply tell the jury that he knew the area. They needed to show why the evidence connected him to the crimes. That was where the DNA became so powerful. It was not based on neighborhood rumors. It was not based on speculation. It was biological evidence. And biological evidence could be compared scientifically. The prosecution could place the evidence alongside the testimony of survivors and the investigative record. The result was a case that had multiple independent components. That mattered because any one piece of evidence can be challenged. A witness can be questioned. A memory can be challenged. A police procedure can be examined. But when different forms of evidence point toward the same person, the defense faces a much more difficult task. The case becomes a network. Pull one thread, and the others remain. The jury was ultimately persuaded. Key was convicted. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but investigators continued looking at the past. That decision would lead to another important development. The DNA evidence connected Key to an additional 1994 rape. The significance of that connection cannot be overstated. The case was years old. The victim had already lived through the uncertainty. The evidence had been preserved. And now the same genetic profile provided a connection. For the victim, the passage of time had not erased a crime. It had simply delayed the identification of the person responsible. This is the paradox of cold cases. Time can feel like an enemy, but time can also become an ally. Every year brings new technology, new databases, new analytical methods, new investigators, new ways of understanding old evidence. A crime committed before the modern forensic era can become solvable decades later. The evidence may have been collected correctly even if it could not be fully analyzed at the time. That possibility is one reason law enforcement agencies preserve biological evidence so carefully. They cannot predict what tomorrow's science will make possible. A sample that appears limited today may contain enough information for a future laboratory. A DNA profile that cannot be matched today may find a match years later. A case with no suspect may suddenly receive one because of another investigation. The chain can continue long after the original detectives have retired. The Aaron Key case illustrates that principle in a particularly powerful way. The investigation began before DNA had become the dominant forensic tool it would later become. By the time investigators had Key's profile, the technology had changed the nature of the case. That change did not happen overnight. It was part of a larger transformation in criminal justice. For decades, investigators relied heavily on fingerprints, eyewitnesses, confessions, physical evidence, informants, and circumstantial connections. Those tools remain important. But DNA introduced something different. It allowed investigators to connect biological identity to physical evidence with extraordinary precision. It could help exclude innocent suspects. It could identify unknown offenders. It could connect separate crimes. And it could reopen cases that had remained unresolved for years. The public eventually became familiar with the phrase DNA match. But behind those two words is a long process. Collection, preservation, extraction, testing, analysis, comparison, statistical interpretation, documentation, courtroom explanation. Every step matters. A DNA result is only as reliable as the process that produced it. That is why the Key investigation required more than simply finding a match. The evidence had to be handled properly. The laboratory findings had to be documented. The prosecution had to explain the science, and the defense had an opportunity to challenge it. The justice system ultimately accepted the evidence. The conviction followed, but the deeper lesson remained. Forensic science is most powerful when combined with traditional investigation. The DNA can point toward a person. The detective can establish the context. The witness can describe the encounter. The physical evidence can support the timeline. Together, those elements create a complete case. That is precisely what happened here. The case was not solved by a machine. It was solved by people using a machine's information. That distinction is important. Technology does not investigate by itself. Detectives have to decide which cases deserve renewed attention. They have to locate evidence. They have to ask questions. They have to interpret results. They have to follow leads. And they have to keep going when the first answer is not enough. The Key investigation demanded that persistence. Years of work were compressed into a few crucial moments. A suspect was identified. A sample was obtained. A laboratory performed the comparison. A match was established. A fugitive was located. A prosecution followed. And a jury returned its verdict. But behind every one of those moments was another person. The detective who refused to abandon the case. The laboratory technician who processed the evidence. The survivor who agreed to testify. The family member who continued demanding answers. The prosecutor who assembled the evidence. The jury member who listened. Justice is not a single action. It is a chain of actions. Break one link, and the outcome can change. Strengthen the links, and an old case can finally move. The case also demonstrates why victims must remain at the center of the story. It is easy to focus on the offender because his name appears in the headlines. But the investigation existed because victims were harmed. Their lives created the cases. Their families demanded answers. Their experiences gave investigators the information they needed, and their evidence helped prosecutors establish the truth. The offender should not become the most important person in the narrative. The victim should. Paula Illera's name belongs in the history of the case because she was a 13-year-old girl whose life was violently taken. Johalis Castro's name belongs there because she was 19 and never had the chance to see what her future could have become. Rashida Washington's name belongs there because she was 18 and her life ended before it had barely begun. The surviving victims belong there because they endured what no person should have to endure and then carried those memories into the courtroom. Their stories were the reason the investigation mattered. Their lives were the reason the evidence mattered. And their suffering was the reason the conviction mattered. That is the human reality beneath the forensic science. A DNA profile may look like a sequence of numbers and letters. But behind every match is a person. Someone who left a biological trace. Someone whose life was changed by the crime. Someone waiting for an answer. That is why forensic evidence can feel almost haunting. It preserves a moment. The offender leaves. The victim may be gone. The witnesses may move away. The neighborhood changes. But the biological trace remains. It is a tiny physical reminder that the crime happened, and that reminder can survive years of silence. The Aaron Key case demonstrated what happens when investigators finally have the technology to interpret that reminder. The evidence became a bridge between past and present. The past was not erased. It was reconstructed. The crimes were not undone. They were explained. The victims were not returned. They were remembered, and the offender could no longer hide behind uncertainty. That is what the verdict ultimately represented. Not a restoration, not a reversal, a reckoning. The justice system could not return the years. It could only establish responsibility for what had happened. And after nearly a decade of investigation, the responsibility was placed where prosecutors believed it belonged. With Aaron Key. But even after conviction, one thought remains difficult to escape. What if the evidence had been available earlier? What if the technology had existed in 1991? What if the genetic profile had been identified before another victim was attacked? There is no answer. History cannot be rewritten by forensic science. Science can reveal the past. It cannot change it. That may be the hardest truth in every cold case. The answer can arrive too late. Justice can come after irreversible damage. A conviction can happen after lives have already been destroyed. The laboratory can identify a killer, but it cannot undo the moment when the crime occurred. That is why the story of Aaron Key is ultimately more than a story about a man caught by DNA. It is a story about what happens when time, persistence, and technology finally converge. The first investigators had questions. The evidence had fragments. The families had grief. The survivors had memories. The laboratory had biological material. Years later, all of those pieces finally pointed in the same direction. The name was Aaron Key. The evidence was there. The crimes were connected. and the courtroom provided the final judgment. But outside the courtroom, the city continued. Another subway train entered a station. Another taxi crossed an intersection. Another apartment door opened. Another child walked home from school. Life continued in the same city where the crimes had happened. That is how cities absorb tragedy. They keep moving. Buildings remain standing. Streets remain busy. People move into apartments where previous generations lived. New residents may never know the history beneath their feet. But somewhere inside the records, the story remains. A file. A photograph. A laboratory report. A name. A verdict. And the memory of people whose lives ended far too soon. The evidence had waited for years. It had survived the changing city. It had survived changing technology. It had survived the disappearance of headlines. And eventually, it had done what evidence is supposed to do. It told investigators where the truth was. The truth was not in the rumors. It was not in the fear. It was not in the speculation. It was inside the evidence. And once investigators knew how to read it, the silence could no longer protect the man responsible.